Hi, guys, and welcome to Read Aloud. If you don't know, we are almost done with the second Crispin book, and I know you guys wanted to finish that in person. So for the next 6 days, we're going to read this book. I know it's backwards. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline L'Engle. This is my favorite book of all time. Not just children's books, just books of all time. So I think they're really going to like it. You've read this before, right? This is my sister, Holly. She's going to be doing some voices to make this more of an engaging experience for you all. Holly can lift up one eyebrow. Show them. Isn't that crazy? Okay. So we've got a lot to get through. So let's just kind of begin. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand, and I'm sure Miss Emily or Miss Tiffany will pause the video. Please don't talk. Please don't break any fidgets, and for Pete's sake, Paxton, don't squish Peyton. Yes, this has all happened. I hope you guys enjoy, and let's begin. Chapter 1, Mrs. Whatsit. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the trees, clouds scurried frantically across the sky. Every few moments, the moon ripped through them, creating wrath-like shadows that raced across the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of weather.
It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else. On top of me. On top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong.
School. School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of the teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg, I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to be can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back a year." During lunch, she'd been roughhoused a little to try to make herself feel better, and one of the girls had said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't in grammar school anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home from school, walking up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under one eye. Sandy and Denny's, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than she did, were disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her.
A delinquent, that's what I am.
She thought grimly.
That's what they'll be saying next. Not Mother, but them. Everybody else. I wish Father...
But it was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back." Gets back from where? And when? Surely her mother must know what people are saying, must be aware of the smugly vicious gossip. Surely it must hurt her as much as it did Meg. But if it did, she gave no outward sign. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression.
Why can't I hide it too?
Meg thought.
Why do I always have to show everything?
The window rattled madly in the wind, and she pulled the quilt close to her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluff of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue, tucked its head under again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg, even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who had come so many nights tiptoeing up to the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio there had been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her in the attic in a rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown off the house, and she tossed out into the wild night sky to a land who knows where? Her shivering grew uncontrollable.
You asked to have the attic bedroom, she told herself savagely. Mother let you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment. Not during a hurricane. It isn't for privilege,
she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down on the foot of the bed and stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked back up at her with huge, innocent eyes.
Go back to sleep, Meg said. Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me.
She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, bearing a mouthful of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse-brown hair so that it stood wildly on end, and let out a sigh almost as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices about the window frame, in spite of the protection of the storm sash was supposed to offer. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened too. What was he barking at? Fortinbras never barked without reason. Suddenly she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she had heard about a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated on a back road as it was, and this time maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at the time, because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she'd heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main hammock, pumping against the ping-pong table.
Now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else,
she thought. Next she walked into her old doll's house, Charles Wallace's rocking horse, and the twins' electric trains.
Why must everything happen to me? She demanded to a large teddy bear.
At the foot of the attic stairs she stood and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room on the right. On the left, in her parents' room, not a rustle from her mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing against her glasses as though they could help her see better in the dark. Denny's was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with a succession of B's and an occasional A or C. They were strong and fast runners and good at games, and when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy and Denny's. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking 7th step. Fortinbras had stopped barking. It wasn't the tramp this time, then. Fort would go on barking if anybody was around.
But suppose the tramp does come. Suppose he has a knife. Nobody lives near enough to hear if we screamed and screamed and screamed. Nobody'd care anyhow. I'll make myself some cocoa,
she decided.
That'll cheer me up. And if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it.
In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable, sitting there alone in the big old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Denons, his feet swagging a good 6 inches above the floor. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I've been waiting for you." From under the table where he was lying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping for a crumb or two, Fortinbras raised his slender dark head in greeting to Meg, and his tail thumped against the floor. Fortinbras had arrived on their doorstep, a half-grown puppy, scrawny and abandoned one winter night. He was, Meg's father had decided, part Llewellyn setter and part greyhound, and he had a slender, dark beauty that was all his own.
"Why didn't you come up to the attic?"
Meg asked her brother, speaking as though he were at least her own age.
"I have been scared stiff."
"Too windy up in that attic of yours," the little boy said. "I knew you'd be down. I put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now." How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How could he always tell? He never knew, or seemed to care what Denny's or Sandy were thinking. It was her mother's mind, and Meg's, that he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people were a little afraid of him that they whispered about the Murray's youngest child, who rumored to be not quite so bright?
"I've heard that clever people often have subnormal
Oh, that's
children."
what she overheard, sorry. Meg overheard. "The boys seem nice, regular children, but that unattractive girl and the baby boys certainly aren't all there." It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he'd never learned to talk. And it was true that he hadn't talked at all until he was almost 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and chuckled, shaking their heads sadly. "Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg," her father had once told her. Meg remembered it very clearly because it was shortly before he went away. "There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things in his own way and in his own time."
"I don't want him to grow up to be dumb like me,"
Meg had said. "Oh, my darling, you're not dumb," her father answered. "You're like Charles Wallace. Your development has to go at its own pace. It doesn't happen to be the usual pace."
"How do you know?"
Meg had demanded.
"How do you know I'm not dumb? Isn't it just because you love me?"
"I love you, but that's not what tells me. Mother and I have given you a number of tests, you know." Yes, that was true. Meg had realized that some of the games her parents played with her were tests of some kind, and that it had been more for her and Charles Wallace than for the twins.
IQ tests, you mean?
Yes, some of them.
Is my IQ okay?
More than okay.
What is it?
I'm not going to tell you, But it assures me that both you and Charles Wallace will be able to do pretty much whatever you like when you grow up to yourselves. You just wait till Charles Wallace starts to talk. You'll see. How right he had been about that, though he himself had left before Charles Wallace had begun to speak. Suddenly, with none of the usual baby preliminaries, using entire sentences. How proud he would have been. You'd better check the milk, Charles Wallace said to Meg, his diction clearer and cleaner than that of most 5-year-olds. You know you don't like it when it gets on the skin when it gets skin on the top.
You put in more than twice enough milk.
Meg peered into the saucepan. Charles Wallace nodded serenely. I thought Mother would like some. I might like what? A voice said, and there was their mother standing in the doorway. Coco, Charles Wallace said, would you like a liverwurst and cream cheese sandwich? I'll be happy to make you one. That would be lovely, Mrs. Murray said, but I can make it myself if you're busy. No trouble at all. Charles Wallace slid from his chair and trotted over to the refrigerator, his pajamaed feet padding softly as a kitten's. How about you, Meg? He asked. Sandwich?
Yes, please, she said, but not liverwurst. Do we have any tomatoes?
Charles Wallace peered into the crisper. One. All right if I use it on Meg, Mother. To what better use could it be put? Mrs. Murray smiled. But not so loud, please, Charles. That is, unless you want the twins downstairs, too. Let's be exclusive, Charles Wallace said. That's my new word for the day. Impressive, isn't it? Prodigious, Mrs. Murray said. Meg, come let me look at that bruise. Meg knelt at her mother's feet. The warmth and light of the kitchen had relaxed her so that her attic fears were gone. The cocoa steamed fragrantly in the saucepan. Geraniums bloomed on the windowsills, and there was a bouquet of tiny yellow chrysanthemums in the center of the table. The curtains, red with a blue and green geometrical pattern, were drawn, and seemed to reflect their cheerfulness throughout the room. The furnace purred like a great sleepy animal. The lights glowed with steady radiance. Outside, alone in the dark, the wind still batted against the house, but the angry power that frightened Meg while she was alone in the attic was subdued by the familiar comfort of the kitchen. Underneath Mrs. Murray's chair, Fortinbras let out a contented sigh. Mrs. Murray gently touched Meg's bruised cheek. Meg looked up at her mother, half in loving admiration, half in sullen resentment. It was not an advantage to have a mother who was a scientist and a beauty as well. Mrs. Murray's flaming red hair, creamy skin, and violet eyes with dark, long lashes seemed even more spectacular in comparison with Meg's outrageous plainness. Meg's hair had been passable as long as she wore it tidily in braids. When she got into high school, it was cut, and now she and her mother struggled with putting it up. One side would come out curly and the other straight, so it looked even plainer than before. Don't you know the meaning of moderation, my darling? Mrs. Murray asked. A happy medium is something I wonder if you'll ever learn. That's a nasty bruise the Henderson boy gave you. By the way, shortly after you'd gone to bed, his mother called him up to complain about how badly you'd hurt him. I told her that since he's a year older and at least 25 pounds heavier than you are, I thought I was the one who ought to be doing the complaining. But she seemed to think it was all your fault.
I suppose that depends on how you look at it,
Meg said.
Usually, no matter what happens, people think it's my fault, even if I have nothing to do with it at all. But I'm sorry I tried to fight him. It's just been an awful week, and I'm full of bad feeling.
Mrs. Murray stroked Meg's shaggy head. Do you know why?
I hate being an oddball,
Meg said.
It's hard on Sandy and Denny's, too. I don't know if they're really like everybody else, or if they're just able to pretend they are. I try to pretend, but it isn't any help.
You're much too straightforward to be able to pretend to be what you aren't, Mrs. Murray said. I'm sorry, Meglet. Maybe if Father were here he could help you, but I don't know if I can do anything till you've managed to plow through some more time. Then things will be easier for you. But that isn't much help right now, is it?
Maybe if I weren't so repulsive looking. Maybe if I were pretty like you.
Mother is not a bit pretty. She's beautiful, Charles Wallace announced, slicing a liverwurst. Therefore, I bet she was awful at your age. How right you are, Mrs. Murray said. Just give yourself time, Meg. Lettuce on your sandwich, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. No, thanks. He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set it in front of their mother. Yours will be along in just a minute, Meg. I think I'll still talk to Mrs. Whatsit about you.
Who's Mrs. Whatsit?
Meg asked. I think I want to be exclusive about her for a while, Charles Wallace said. Onion salt?
Yes, please.
What's Mrs. Whatsit stand for? Mrs. Murray asked. That's her name, Charles Wallace answered. You know, the old shingled house in the backwoods that the kids don't go near because they say it's haunted? That's where they live. They? Mrs. Whatsit and her two friends. I went out with Fortinbras a couple days ago. You and the twins were at school, Meg. We like to walk in the woods, and suddenly he took after a squirrel, and I took after him, and we ended up by the haunted house. So I met them by accident, you might say.
But nobody lives there,
Meg said. Mrs. Whatsit and her friends do. They're very enjoyable. Why didn't you tell me about it before? Mrs. Murray asked. And you know you're not supposed to go off our property without permission, Charles. I know, Charles said. That's one reason I didn't tell you. I just rushed off after Fortinbras without thinking. And then I decided, well, I'd better save them from an emergency anyhow. A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it, and suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows.
I don't like this wind,
Meg said nervously. We'll lose some shingles off the roof, that's certain, Mrs. Murray said. But this house has stood for almost 200 years, and I think it'll last a little longer, Meg. There's been many a high wind on this hill.
But this is a hurricane,
Meg wailed.
The radio kept saying it was a hurricane.
It's October, Mrs. Murray told her. There have been storms in October before. As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fortinbras came out from under the table. He gave a long, low growl, and they could see the dark fur slowly rising on his back. Meg felt her own skin prickle.
What's wrong?
She asked anxiously. Fortinbras stared at the door that opened into Mrs. Murray's laboratory, which was in the old stone diary right off the kitchen. Beyond the lab, a pantry led outdoors, though Mrs. Murray had done her best to train the family to come into the house through the garage door or the front door and not through her lab. But it was the lab door and not the garage door towards which Fortinbras was growling. You didn't leave any nasty-smelling chemicals cooking over a Bunsen burner, did you, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. Mrs. Murray stood up. No, but I think I'd better go see what's upsetting Ford anyhow.
It's the tramp. I'm sure it's the tramp,
Meg said nervously. What tramp? Charles Wallace asked.
They were saying at the post office this afternoon that a tramp stole all of Mrs. Buncombe's sheets.
We'd better sit on the pillowcases then, Mrs. Murray said lightly. I don't think even a tramp would be out on a night like this, Meg.
But that's probably why he is out,
Meg wailed.
Trying to find a place not to be out.
In which case I'll offer him the barn till morning. Mrs. Murray went briskly to the door.
I'll go with you.
Meg's voice was shrill. No, Meg, you stay with Charles Wallace and eat your sandwich.
Eat?
Meg exclaimed as Mrs. Murray went out through the lab.
How does she expect me to eat?
Mother can take care of herself, Charles said. Physically, that is. But he sat in his father's chair at the table and his legs kicked at the rungs, and Charles Wallace, unlike most small children, had the ability to sit still. After a few moments that seemed to go on like forever to Meg, Mrs. Murray came back in, holding the door open for... Was it the tramp? It seemed small for Meg's idea of a tramp. The age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied around the head, and a man's felt hat perched atop. A shocking pink stole was knotted around a rough overcoat, and black rubber boots covered the feet. Mrs. Whatsit, Charles said suspiciously. What are you doing here? And at this time of night, too. Now don't you worry about me, honey. A voice emerged from among the turned-up coat collar, stole, scarves, and hat. A voice like an unoiled gate, but somehow not unpleasant. Mrs. Whatsit says she has lost her way, Mrs. Murray said. Would you care for some hot chocolate, Mrs. Whatsit? Charmed, I'm sure, Mrs. Whatsit answered, taking off the hat and the stole. This isn't so much that I lost my way as I got blown off course, and when I realized I was at little Charles Wallace's house, I just thought I had to come in and rest a bit before proceeding on my way.
How did you know this was Charles Wallace's house?
Meg asked. By the smell. Mrs. Whatsit untied a blue and green paisley scarf, a red and yellow flowered print, a gold liberty print, a red and black bandana. Under all this, a sparse quantity of grayish hair was tied in a small but tidy knot atop her head. Her eyes were bright, her nose was a round, soft blob, her mouth puckered like an autumn apple. My, but it's lovely and warm in here, she said. Do sit down, Mrs. Murray indicated a chair. Would you like a sandwich, Mrs. Whatsit? I've had liverwurst and cream cheese, Charles has had bread and jam, and Meg lettuce and tomato. Now let me see, Mrs. Whatsit pondered. I'm passionately fond of Russian caviar. You peaked, Charles cried indignantly. We're saving that for Mother's birthday, and you can't have any. Mrs. Whatsit gave a deep and pathetic sigh. No, Charles said. Now you mustn't give in to her, Mother, or I shall be very angry. How about tuna fish salad? All right, Mrs. Whatsit said meekly.
I'll fix it,
Meg offered, going to the pantry for a can of tuna fish.
For crying out loud,
she thought.
This old woman comes barging in on us in the middle of the night, and Mother takes it as though there weren't anything peculiar about it at all. I bet she is the tramp. I bet she did steal those sheets. And she's certainly no one Charles Wallace ought to be friends with, especially when he won't even talk to ordinary people.
I've only been in the neighborhood a short time, Mrs. Whatsit was saying when Meg switched off the pantry light and came back into the kitchen with tuna fish. And I didn't think I was going to like the neighbors at all until dear little Charles came over with his dog. Mrs. Whatsit, Charles Wallace demanded severely, why did you take Mrs. Buncombe's sheets? Well, I needed them, Charles dear. You must return them at once. But Charles dear, I can't. I've used them. It was very wrong of you, Charles Wallace scolded. If you needed sheets that badly, you should have asked me. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head and chuckled. You can't spare any sheets. Mrs. Buncombe can. Meg cut up some celery and mixed it in with the tuna. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the refrigerator door and brought out a jar of little sweet pickles.
Though why I'm doing it for her, I don't know, she thought as she cut them up. I don't trust her one bit.
Tell your sister that I'm all right, Mrs. Whatsit said to Charles. Tell her my intentions are good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Charles intoned. My, but isn't he cunning, Mrs. Whatsit beamed at him fondly. It's lucky he has someone to understand him. But I'm afraid he doesn't, Mrs. Murray said. None of us is quite up to Charles. But at least you aren't trying to squash him down, Mrs. Whatsit nodded her head vigorously. You're letting him be himself.
Here's your sandwich,
Meg said, bringing it to Mrs. Whatsit. Do you mind if I take off my boots before I eat? Mrs. Whatsit asked, picking up the sandwich nevertheless. Listen. She moved her feet up and down in her boots, and they could hear the water squelching. My toes are ever so damp. The trouble is that these boots are a mite too tight for me, and I can never take them off by myself. I'll help you, Charles offered. Not you. You're not strong enough. I'll help. Mrs. Murray squatted at Mrs. Whatsit's feet, yanking on one slick boot. When the boot came off, it came suddenly. Mrs. Murray sat down with a thump. Mrs. Whatsit went tumbling backward into the chair onto the floor, sandwich held high in one old claw. Water poured out of the boot and ran over the floor into the big braided rug. Oh, dearie me, Mrs. Whatsit said, lying on her back in the overturned chair, her feet in the air, one red and white striped sock, the other still booted. Mrs. Murray got to her feet. Are you all right, Mrs. Whatsit? If you have some liniment, I'll put it on my dignity, Mrs. Whatsit said, still supine. I think it's sprained. A little oil of cloves mixed well with garlic is rather good. She took a large bite of sandwich. Do please get up, Charles said. I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far. Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity? But Mrs. Whatsit scrambled up, righted in the chair, and then sat back down on the floor, the booted foot stuck out in front of her, and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman. At least Meg was reasonably sure that she was an old woman, and a very old woman at that. Mrs. Whatsit, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murray. No, pull while I'm already down. Quite calmly, as though this old woman and her boots were nothing out of the ordinary, Mrs. Murray pulled until the second boot relinquished the foot. The foot was covered in a blue and gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Whatsit sat there wriggling her toes, contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet. Ah, she said, that's ever so much better, and took both boots and shook them out over the sink. My stomach is full and I'm warm inside and out, and I think it's time I went home. Don't you think you'd better stay till morning? Oh, thank you, dearie, but there's just so much to do. I just can't waste time sitting around fribbling. It's much too wild a night to travel in. Wild nights are my glory, Mrs. Whatsit said. I just got caught in a downdraft and blown off course. Well, at least stay until your socks dry. Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water squishing around in my boots. Now don't worry about me, lamb. Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murray. I shall just sit down for a moment and pop on my boots, and then I'll be on my way. Speaking of ways, pet, by the way, there is such a thing as a tesseract. Mrs. Murray went very white and with one hand reached backward and clutched a chair for support. Her voice trembled. What did you say? Mrs. Whatsit tugged at her second boot. I said, she grunted, shoving her foot down, that there is, such a thing, as a tesseract. Her foot went down into the boot, and grabbing shawls, scarves, and hat, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murray stayed very still, making no move to help the old woman. As the door opened, Fortinbras streaked in, panting, wet and shiny as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murray and whined. The door slammed.
Mother, what's the matter?
Meg cried.
What did you say? What is it?
The tesseract, Mrs. Murray whispered. What did she mean? How could she have known? Okay, we have a little tradition here during Read Aloud. Between chapters, we just kind of stare at them.
Oh, okay.
And then they yell at me and throw things at me. I'm going to pretend this is Paxton throwing something at me. I think that went well. Should we read more? What do you think? Should we read more?
Yeah,
I think we should read some more. Chapter 2. Mrs. Who. When Meg woke to the jangling of her alarm clock, the wind was still blowing, but the sun was shining. The worst of the storm was over. She sat up in bed, shaking her head to clear it. It must have been a dream. She'd been frightened by the storm and worried about the tramp, so she just dreamed what was going on down to the kitchen and seeing Mrs. Whatsit and having her mother get all frightened and upset by the word, what was it? Tess something. She dressed hurriedly, picked up the kitten still curled up on her bed, and dumped it unceremoniously onto the floor. The kitten yawned, stretched, gave a piteous macaw, trotted out into the attic and down the stairs. Meg made her bed and hurried after it. In the kitchen, her mother was making French toast, and the twins were already at the table. The kitten was lapping milk out of a saucer.
Where's Charles?
Meg asked. Still asleep. We had a rather interrupted night, if you remember.
I hoped it was a dream,
Meg said. Her mother carefully turned over 4 slices of French toast, then said in a steady voice, No, Meg, don't hope it was a dream. I don't understand it any more than you do, but one thing I've learned is that you don't have to understand things for them to be. I'm sorry I showed you I was upset. Your father and I used to have a joke about a tesseract.
What is a tesseract?
Meg asked. It's a concept. Mrs. Murray handed the twins the syrup. I'll try to explain it to you later. There isn't time before school. I don't see why you didn't wake us up, Denny said. It's a jip we missed out on all the fun.
You'll be a lot more awake in school today than I will.
Meg took her French toast to the table. Who cares, Sandy said. If you're going to let the old tramps come into the house in the middle of the night, Mother, you ought to have Den and me around to protect you. After all, Father would expect us to, Denny's added. We all know you have a great mind and all, Mother, Sandy said, but you don't have much sense, and certainly Meg and Charles don't.
I know. We're morons.
Meg was bitter. I wish you wouldn't be such a dope, Meg. Syrup, please. Sandy reached across the table. You don't have to take everything so personally. Use a happy medium, for heaven's sake. You're just a goof around in school and look out the window and don't pay any attention. And to make things harder for yourself, Denny said. And Charles Wallace, you just make things harder for yourself, Denny said. And Charles Wallace is going to have an awful time next year when he starts school. We know he's bright, but he's so funny when he's around other people. And they're so used to thinking he's dumb. I don't know what's going to happen to him. Sandy and I will sock anybody who picks on him, but that's about all we can do. Let's not worry about next year till we get through this one, Mrs. Murray said. More French toast, boys? Oh my gosh, I keep dripping on this book. It's a learning center book, too. I should stop dripping water on it. Sorry, Miss Emily. At school, Meg was tired and her eyelids sagged and her mind wandered. In social studies, she was asked to name the principal imports and exports of Nicaragua, and though she had looked up dutifully the evening before, now she could remember none of them. The teacher was sarcastic, the rest of the class laughed, and she flung herself down into the seat in a fury.
Who cares about the imports and exports of Nicaragua anyhow?
She muttered. If you're going to be rude, Margaret, you may leave the room, the teacher said.
Okay, I will.
Meg flounced out. During study hall, the principal sent for her. What seems to be the problem now, Meg? He asked, pleasantly enough. Meg looked sulkily down at the floor.
Nothing, Mr. Jenkins.
Miss Porter tells me you were inexcusable inexcusably rude. Meg shrugged. Don't you realize that you just make everything harder for yourself by your attitude? The principal asked. Now, Meg, I'm convinced that you can do the work and keep up your grade if you will apply yourself, but some of your teachers are not. You're going to have to do something about yourself. Nobody can do it for you. Meg was silent. Well, what about it, Meg?
I don't know what to do,
Meg said. You could do your homework for one thing. Wouldn't your mother help you?
if I asked her to.
Meg, is something troubling you? Are you unhappy at home? Mr. Jenkins asked. At last, Meg looked at him, pushing out her glasses in a characteristic gesture.
Everything's fine at home.
I'm glad to hear it, but I know it must be hard on you to have your father away. Meg eyed the principal wearily and ran her tongue over the barbed lines of her braces. Have you had any news from him lately? Meg was sure it was not only the imagination that made her feel bad, that behind Mr. Jenkins' surface concern was a gleam of avid curiosity. Wouldn't he like to know? Oh, that was you.
Wouldn't he like to know?
She thought.
And if I knew anything, he's the last person I'd tell. Well, one of the last.
The postmistress must know that it was about a year since the last letter, and heaven knows how many people she'd told or what unkind guesses she'd make about the reason of the long silence. Mr. Jenkins waited for an answer, but Meg only shrugged. Just what is your father's line of business? Mr. Jenkins asked. Some kind of scientist, wasn't he?
He is a physicist.
Meg braced her teeth to reveal the ferocious lines of braces. Meg, don't you think you'd make a better adjustment to life if you face facts?
I do face facts,
Meg said.
They're a lot easier to face than people, I can tell you.
Then why don't you face the facts about your father?
You leave my father out of it,
Meg shouted. Stop bellowing, Mr. Jenkins said sharply. Do you want the entire school to hear you?
So what?
Meg demanded.
I'm not ashamed of anything I'm saying. Are you?
Mr. Jenkins sighed. Do you enjoy being the most belligerent, uncooperative child in this school? Meg ignored this. She leaned over the desk toward the principal.
Mr. Jenkins, you've met my mother, haven't you? You can't accuse her of not doing facts, can you? She's a scientist. She has doctor's degrees in both biology and bacteriology. Her business is facts. When she tells me that my father isn't coming home, I'll believe it. As long as she says father is coming home, then I'll believe that.
Mr. Jenkins sighed again. No doubt your mother wants to believe your father is coming home, Meg. Very well, I can't do anything else with you. Go back on to study hall. Try to be a little less antagonistic. Maybe your work would improve if your general attitude were more tractable? I don't even know what that means. When Meg got home from school, her mother was in the lab, the twins were at Little League, and Charles Wallace, the kitten, and Fortinbras were waiting for her. Fortinbras jumped, put his front paws on his shoulders, and gave a kiss, and the kitten rushed to his empty saucer and mewed loudly. Come on, Charles Wallace said. Let's go.
Where?
Meg asked.
I'm hungry, Charles, and I don't want to go anywhere until I've had something to eat.
She was still sore from the interview with Mr. Jenkins, and her voice sounded cross. Charles Wallace looked at her thoughtfully, and she went to the refrigerator and gave the kitten some milk, then drank a mugful herself. He handed her a paper bag. Here's a sandwich and some cookies and an apple. I thought we'd better go see Mrs. Whatsit.
Oh, golly,
Meg said.
Why, Charles?
You're still uneasy about her, aren't you? Charles asked.
Well, yes.
Don't be. She's all right. I promise you. She's on our side.
How do you know?
Meg, he said impatiently. I know.
But why should we go see her now?
I want to find out more about that Tesseract thing. Didn't you see how it upset Mother? You know when Mother can't control the way she feels. She lets us see she's upset, then it's something big. Meg thought for a moment.
Okay, let's go. But let's take Fortinbras with us.
Well, of course. He needs the exercise. They set off, Fortinbras rushing ahead, then doubling back to the two children, then leaping off again. The Murrays lived about 4 miles out of the village. Behind the house was a pine woods, and it was through this that Charles Wallace took Meg.
Charles, you know she's gonna get in awful trouble. Mrs. Whatsit, I mean, if they find out she's broken into the haunted house. And taking Mrs. Bunkoby's sheets and everything. They could send her to jail.
One of the reasons I want to go over this afternoon is to warn them.
Them?
I told you she was there with her 2 friends. I'm not even sure it was Mrs. Whatsit herself who took the sheets, though I wouldn't put it past her.
But what would she want all those sheets for?
I intend to ask her, Charles Wallace said, and to tell them they'd better be more careful. I don't really think they'll let anybody find them, but I just thought we ought to mention the possibility. Sometimes during vacation, some of the boys go out there looking for thrills, but I don't think anybody's apt to right now with that basketball and everything. They walked in silence for a moment through the fragrant woods, the rusty pine needles gentle under their feet. Up above them, the wind made music in the branches. Charles Wallace slipped his hands confidingly in Meg's, and the sweet little boy gesture warmed her heart so that she felt the tense knot inside her stomach begin to loosen. Charles loves me at any rate, she thought. School awful again today? He asked after a while.
Yeah, I got sent to Mr. Jenkins. He made snide remarks about Father.
Charles Wallace nodded sagely. I know.
How do you know?
Charles Wallace shook his head. I can't quite explain. You tell me, that's all.
But I never say anything. You just seem to know.
Everything about you tells me, Charles said.
How about the twins?
Meg asked.
Do you know about them, too?
I suppose I could if I wanted to, if they needed me. But it's sort of tiring, so I just concentrate on you and Mother.
You mean you read our minds?
Charles Wallace looked troubled. I don't think it's that. It's being able to understand a sort of language. Like sometimes if I concentrate very hard, I can understand the wind talking with the trees. You tell me, you see, it's sort of inadvertently. That's a good word, isn't it? I got Mother to look it up in the dictionary for me this morning. I really must learn to read, except I'm afraid it will make it awfully hard for me in school next year if I already know things. And I think it will be better if people go on thinking I'm not very bright. They won't hate me quite so much. Ahead of them, Fortinbras started barking loudly, the warning bay that usually told them that a car was coming up on the road or someone was at the door. Somebody's here, Charles Wallace said sharply. Somebody's hanging around the house. Come on. He started to run, his short legs straining. At the edge of the woods, Fortinbras stood in front of a boy, barking furiously. As they came out panting, the boy said,
For crying out loud, call off your dog.
Who is he? Charles Wallace asked Meg.
Calvin O'Keefe. He's in regional, but he's older than I am. He's a big bug. It's all right, fella. I'm not going to hurt you,
the boy said to Fortinbras. Sit, Fort, Charles Wallace commanded, and Fortinbras dropped to his haunches in front of the boy, a low growl still pulsing in his dark throat. Okay, Charles Wallace put his hands on his hips. Now tell us what you're doing here.
I might ask the same of you, the boy said with some indignation. Aren't you two of the Murray kids? This isn't your property, is it?
He started to move, but Fortinbras's growl grew louder and he stopped. Tell me about him, Meg, Charles Wallace demanded.
What would I know about him?
Meg asked.
He's a couple of grades above me, and he's on the basketball team. Just because I'm tall.
Calvin sounded a little embarrassed. Tall he certainly was, and skinny. His bony wrists stuck out of the sleeves of his blue sweater. His worn corduroy trousers were 3 inches too short. He had orange hair that needed cutting, and the appropriate freckles to go with it. His eyes were an oddly bright blue. Tell us what you're doing here, Charles Wallace said.
What is this? The 3rd degree? Aren't you the one who's supposed to be the moron?
Meg flushed with rage, but Charles Wallace answered placidly. That's right. If you want me to call my dog off, you'd better give.
Most peculiar moron I've ever met,
Calvin said.
I just came to get away from my family.
Charles Wallace nodded. What kind of family?
They all have runny noses. I'm 3rd from the top of 11 kids. I'm a sport.
And so Charles Wallace grinned wildly. So am I.
I don't mean like in baseball,
Calvin said. Neither do I.
I mean like in biology,
Calvin said suspiciously. A change in gene, Charles Wallace quoted, resulting in the appearance of the offspring of a character which is not present in the parents, which is potentially transmissible to its offspring.
What gives around here?
Calvin asked.
I was told you couldn't talk.
Thinking I'm a moron gives people something to feel smug about, Charles Wallace said. Why should I disillusion them? How old are you, Cal?
14.
What grade?
Junior, 11th. I'm bright. Listen, did anyone ask you to come here this afternoon?
Charles Wallace, holding Fort by the collar, looked at Calvin suspiciously. What do you mean, asked? Calvin shrugged.
You still don't trust me, do you?
I don't distrust you, Charles Wallace said.
Do you want to tell me why you're here then?
Fort and Meg and I decided to go for a walk. We often do in the afternoon. Calvin dug his hands into his pockets.
You're holding out on me.
Sorry you, Charles Wallace said.
Okay, old sport,
Calvin said.
I'll tell you this much. Sometimes I get a feeling about things. You might call it a compulsion. Do you know what compulsion means?
Constraint, obligation, because one is compelled. Not a very good definition, but it's the concise Oxford.
Okay.
Calvin sighed.
I must remember I'm preconditioned in my concept of your mentality.
Meg sat down on the coarse grass at the edge of the woods. Fort gently twisted his collar out of Charles Wallace's hands and came over to Meg, lying down beside her and putting his head in her lap. Calvin tried now politely to direct his words toward Meg as well as Charles Wallace.
When I get this feeling, this compulsion, I always do what it tells me. I can't explain where it comes from or how I get it, and it doesn't happen very often. But I obey it. In this afternoon, I had a feeling that I must come over to the haunted house. That's all I know, kid. I'm not holding anything back. Maybe it's because I'm supposed to meet you. You tell me.
Charles Wallace looked at Calvin probingly for a moment. Then an almost glazed look came into his eyes, and he seemed to be thinking at him. Calvin stood very still and waited. At last, Charles Wallace said, Okay, I believe you, but I can't tell you. I think I'd like to trust you. Maybe you'd better come home with us and have dinner.
Well, sure, but what would your mother say to that?
Calvin asked. She'd be delighted. Mother's all right. She's not one of us, but she's all right.
What about Meg?
Meg has it tough, Charles Wallace said. She's not really one thing or the other.
What do you mean, one of us?
Meg demanded.
What do you mean I'm not one thing or the other?
Not now, Meg, Charles Wallace said. Slowly. I'll tell you about it later. He looked at Calvin, then seemed to make a quick decision. Okay, let's take him to meet Mrs. Whatsit. If he's not okay, she'll know. He started off with his short legs toward the dilapidated old house. The haunted house was half in the shadows of the clump of elms in which it stood. The elms were almost bare now, and the ground around the house was yellow with damp leaves. The late afternoon light had a greenish cast, which the blank windows reflected in a sinister way. An unhinged shutter thumped. Something else creaked. Meg did not wonder that the house had a What the heck is wrong with me? Meg did not wonder that the house had a reputation for being haunted. A board was nailed across the front door, but Charles Wallace led the way around to the back. The door there appeared to be nailed shut too, but Charles Wallace knocked and the door swung slowly outward, creaking on rusty hinges. Up in one of the elms, an old black crow gave a raucous cry, and a woodpecker went into a wild rat-a-tat-tat. A large gray rat scuttled around the corner of the house, and Meg let out a stifled shriek. They get a lot of fun out there using all the typical props, Charles Wallace said in a reassuring voice. Come on, follow me. Calvin put a strong hand on Meg's elbow, and Fort pressed against her leg. Happiness at the concern was so strong in her that her panic fled, and she followed Charles Wallace into the dark recesses of the home without fear. They entered into a sort of a kitchen. There was a huge fireplace and a big black pot hanging over a merry fire. Why had there been no smoke visible from the chimney? Something in the pot was bubbling, and it smelled more like one of Mrs. Murray's chemical messes than something to eat. In a dilapidated Boston rocker sat a plump little woman. She wasn't Mrs. Whatsit, so she must, Meg decided, be one of Mrs. Whatsit's two friends. She wore enormous spectacles, twice as thick and twice as large as Meg's, and she was sewing busily, with rapid jabbing stitches on a sheet. Several other sheets lay on the dusty floor. Charles Wallace went up to her. I really don't think you ought to have taken Mr. Buncombe's sheets, Mrs. Buncombe's sheets, without consulting me, he said, as cross and bossy as only a small boy could be. What on earth do you want them for? The plump little woman beamed at him. Okay, well, this lady speaks in French a lot, so this is going to be like when I did the Latin in Crispin. It's not going to be very good. Okay, so just be with me. What, Clarice, my pet? Le course results in crossing the equatorial point. French, Pascal. The heart has its reasons, whereof no reason knows nothing. But that's not appropriate at all, Charles said crossly. Your mother would find it so. A smile seemed to gleam through the roundness of spectacles. I'm not talking about my mother's feelings about my father, Charles Wallace scolded. I'm talking about Mrs. Buncombe's sheets. The little woman sighed. The enormous glasses caught the light again and shone like an owl's eyes. In case we need ghosts, of course, she said. I should think you have guessed. If we have to frighten anybody away, what's it thought we ought to do appropriately? That's why it's so much fun to stay in a haunted house. But we really didn't mean you to know about the sheets. Officer Tetrachint. German. Infrictilictico. Latin. Caught in the act. English. As I was saying. But Charles Wallace held up his hand in peremptory. So, what she's doing here is she's saying a sentence in a language and then translating it to English. In case you didn't quite catch what she's doing. She's just an interesting character. Charles Wallace held up his hand in a peremptory gesture. Mrs. Who, do you know this boy? Calvin bowed.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I didn't quite catch your name.
Mrs. Who will do, the woman said. He wasn't my idea, Charlesy. She's just calling him Charlesy. But I think he's a good one.
Where's Mrs. Whatsit?
Oh, where's Mrs. Whatsit?
Oh.
Charles asked. She's busy. It's getting near time, Charlesy, getting near time. Abhorrence overinium boom nahal dirtit. Seneca. Nothing deters a good man from doing what is honorable. This lady's voice has changed a lot. And he's a very good man, Charlesy, darling. But right now he needs our help.
Who?
Meg demanded. I'm little Megsy. Lovely to meet you, sweetheart. Your father, of course. Now, what she's saying is she's saying their father needs help. So these ladies know about their father, even though no one else does. Little Megsy. Lovely to meet you, sweetheart. Your father, of course. Now go home, loves. This is not yet ripe. Don't worry, we won't go without you. Get plenty of food and rest. Feed Calvin up. Now off with you. Just to suffer fleas. Latin again, of course. Faith is the sister of justice. Trust in us now, shoo! And she fluttered up from her chair and pushed him out the door with surprising power.
Charles?
Meg said.
I don't understand.
Charles took her by the hand and dragged her away from the house. Fortinbras ran on ahead, and Calvin was very close behind them. No, he said. I don't either yet. Not quite. I'll tell you what I know as soon as I can. But you saw Fort, didn't you? Not a growl, not a quiver. Just as though there weren't anything strange about it. So you know it's okay. Look, do me a favor, both of you. Let's not talk till we've had something to eat. I need fuel so I can sort things out and assimilate them properly.
Lead on, moron,
Calvin cried gaily.
I've never even seen your house, and I have the funniest feeling that for the first time in my life, I'm going home.
All right. Thank you guys for listening well, unless you didn't, but I'm sure you did. My read aloud kids are great. They're like the best kids. Holly's my favorite kid, but other than that, I don't have favorites. Except for Holly and Mia. Not Mia. I'm kidding. I don't have favorites. Anyway, we better get going. We're in my basement. This is Elvis. This is my sister. That's Dr. McCoy. And we will see you all on Monday for the next 2 chapters of the book. Bye.